Back for another 10-minute draft, and this time it's Legacy Cube. Living Death is one of the best first picks in Cube. It's easy to draft around and incredibly powerful. Now seems a good time to start drafting blue, and the original Jace is nothing to be sniffed at. It's difficult to put into words just how much I love Venser. Good in aggro, good in control. He really shapes himself to any Cube deck. Living End lends itself fairly obviously to a reanimation strategy, and Entomb is one of the best cards you can pick up in that strategy. Fact or fiction, this is not, but even though the Pact is great with Venser, the Alchemy works great for me at this point in time. Whip of Erebos is okay with reanimation, but I now run the risk of having nothing to reanimate, so Worm makes a fine pickup. Bitter Blossom is a great backup plan if the reanimation doesn't work out, and Force Spike is meh. Another great reanimation target, and some decent 2-drops round out the first pack. It's a pretty weak pack too, but Sphinx is fine played from hand or graveyard, so I'm happy to take that. I finally pick up another reanimate spell in the next pack, and decide the extra value of Diabolic Servitude outweighs the potential tricksiness of Necromancy. I don't think the extra mana makes too much of a difference, and Mana War is, a pretty annoying card to pass. Which member? Dismember. Clones are generally solid in a format of bombs, and I already have 2 great black cards to copy. Removal's removal, and on-colour Planeswalkers are, well, on-colour Planeswalkers. This card did tempt me, though. Toxic Deluge is a sideboard card, most likely, but a solid one nonetheless. Come on, I can't say no to the Mage of Zhalfir himself now, can I? Some decent but fairly unexciting cards round out the rest of the pack. Silumgar is okay, but it's no fact or fiction. Fact or fiction, on the other hand, is. Skinrender makes a pretty unexciting second pick, whilst Dress makes an even more unexciting third pick. Ending up with a bad mana base is a trap pretty much anyone falls into in Cube, so I take an opportunity to pick up a much-needed dual land, and Liliana's not the best Planeswalker, but it's a nice pickup nonetheless. Sorin's a bit too colour-intensive for my liking, and you can't go wrong with a dragon. A couple of unexciting picks lead me into one that suggests the table's not that experienced with Cube drafting. Vendilion Clique is just really one of the best cards you can get in Cube. But then again, I have a Hexmage, and this is Cube after all. I didn't end up with that many playables, so deck building really just comes down to cutting a single card. My deck's a little slow, but has great late game, so Phyrexian Arena ends up hitting the board, being better suited to the more aggro decks. Round 1 begins pretty well for me as I keep a solid hand and play Bitter Blossom and Hymn to Torak, hitting 2 spells into my opponent's 2 creatures. He looks like a fast red-white deck, which may be troublesome. Fact or fiction on turn 4 leaves with a surprising split of 4 cards which I gladly snap up, even though the Skinrender and Living Death synergy is a bit of an ombo. Unfortunately, Thundermaw Hellkite is pretty much the ideal answer to Bitter Blossom, and just when Kaiga looks set to tide things up, my opponent fires 2 lethal burn spells right in the face. Force Spike comes in over Phyrexian Arena and starts off game 2 by countering a turn 3 Hordling outburst. Hellride was a lot less scary with an empty board and 20 life, especially with Skinrender in hand, so I fire off an end of turn fact or fiction, then eat said rider. Although it feels like bad value, I pay the 4 life to save myself 5 off a dragon and some tempo, then untap, get him for 3, and add a dragon of my own to the board. A rather sad-looking Stormbreath Dragon from my opponent doesn't quite brawl with Kaiga, so it has to sit twiddling its thumbs until I persuade it to my side of the board with some crafty use of the new Legend rule. The game doesn't last much longer after that. Game 3 starts pretty well for both of us, and I think I misplayed by trying to protect a Jace too eagerly. Thankfully my opponent did the same by forcing damage at Jace rather than my face, so I was in a pretty decent position with this spiciness starting on turn 4. So an end of step Forbidden Alchemy whiffs with 4 lands, but the Entomb is what I'm really interested in. I find Massacre Worm, and with Phantasmal Image in my graveyard and Siegegang Commander in my opponent's graveyard, I think something beautiful is about to happen. Unfortunately, it looks like the Phantasmal Image doesn't actually work like that, as it enters the battlefield with nothing to copy, but I still get 8 free life loss and a 6/5 out of the deal. Not too shabby. Next turn, Chandra replaces herself before falling to my worm, and I end up taking some unnecessary damage the turn after that. For some reason I didn't have a stop set in my opponent's beginning combat step, which means I take an extra 1 off Hell Rider, which actually puts me at 4 life, which is lethal to a Stoke the Flames I saw, and also the X burn spell that they do cast, but thankfully Venser off the top helps keep me alive. Round 2 begins with a somewhat sketchy keep, but luckily my opponent's slow start and missed turn 3 land drop lets me run a turn 3 Ashiok out on the draw. My opponent hits a turn 3 land a turn too late and plays a Pelukronos, and this is where things get a little bit spicy. So I can put Huntmaster of the Fells into play off Ashiok, and because I didn't actually cast it, the Huntmaster immediately flips on upkeep. This lets me eat a mana-starved opponent's Hierarch, get 6 powers of blockers on the board against a 5/5 Pelukronos, and still have 4 lands up for an end-of-turn fact or fiction. And that is why I love Cube. So my opponent has to have drawn the instant speed removal this turn, or they would have upkeeped it with the flip trigger on the stack, so I figure I can safely double block. At worst, I tap out for Pelukronos and all the creatures trade, which is exactly what happens. Once the dust has settled, I have an Ashiok in play and a handful of gas to my opponent's stone nothing. Jace draws me the Phantasmal Image for potential Kaiga ridiculousness later on, whilst Ashiok reloads. Kaiga Ridiculousness is off the cards when I figure I'd rather just cash it in now for a 2-mana Thragtusk, while Skinrender converts the opponent's Thragtusk into a meagre elephant. As you might guess, it wasn't long until the concession arrived. Irritatingly, Game 2 didn't record because it was the only one where I made Marital Age, but Round 3 begins with a seemingly perfect start of Bitter Blossom against my opponent's blue-black lands and notable lack of spells. A turn 3 Vendilion Click gives me the option of using Venser as the tempo play, but I figure he has a better use, and none of my cards in hand are particularly crucial right now. Kaiga hits the bench, but replaces itself with something even better. Baleful Strix joins a queue of cards that my Bitter Blossom couldn't care less about, while the Vendilion Click aims to quicken the destiny it faces at the hands of a Gilt-Leaf Winnower. I use Venser to remove the possibility of a counterspell, before letting my Winnower clean up Eye Blights like it was born to do. Not before an attack though, because, remember kids, always attack first. Unless you have a good reason not to, this rule does not apply in all situations and may be subject to change on plan or unexpected bluffs. A do-nothing compulsive research is pretty much exactly what I want to see in this position, and the fact that my opponent awkwardly discarded 2 land cards suggests that my fresh-off-the-top Liliana can make them discard without fearing any kind of big reanimation target in the bin. Apart from that there Wormcoil Engine, of course. I have no idea what's happening here. Fast forward a few turns later and my opponent is doing their best to stay in the game. It turns out they do have a reanimation spell, but at 5 life and facing 5 fairies, they have to just return a Baleful Strix to play. A 7-mana Martial Coup is enough to keep them alive on 1, but that gives my Toxic Deluge something to do, and my game-winning demon faces a Wrath effect the turn later. But there's only so much you can do against the Bitter Blossom at 1 life, and this kind of game is why I love Cube. 1 more attack, and it's over. Game 2 sees me keep the sketchiest of all hands, but who needs skill when you draw like Picasso? The returned turn 2 Bitter Blossom baits out a counterspell, but the turn 3 Ashiok faces no competition. A Vendilion Click does threaten the Ashiok quite nicely, but I can't help but feel my opponent should have taken the go for the throat. Luckily, I'm still very lucky and drew a Duress off the top to take my opponent's only decent card in hand, whilst the removal gives Ashiok free reign of an empty board. I know my opponent has counterspells in hand and don't actually need to cast anything, but they sense this and cast a Desperation Drifter. This lets me live the dream with an end-of-turn Forbidden Alchemy, putting Massacre Worm in the bin and the reanimation spell in hand. The writing was, as they say, very much on the wall. Hey, did you like this video? Then hit the subscribe button. Did you hate it? Subscribe anyway. Have no idea why you're here? Subscribe! Please, just subscribe. Seriously.